So this is my first time in the pulpit, and I'm really excited to be here as part of this series. This month we're marking the season of creation with a focus on eco-anxiety and discipleship, hosted by the pastoral care team. Graham began our series preaching on lament and our need for community, and last week Jono preached on overcoming guilt through love and connection. Eco-anxiety is marked by a sense of stress and overwhelm at the state of our world, at the ways that we are failing to care for and protect the environment, and the ways that catastrophic climate change feels inevitable. Our anxiety, our fear, our discouragement are real. They are real, understandable, and valid emotions in response to our circumstances. Throughout this worship series, the encouragement that we've sought to offer is not to deny these circumstances, but to offer good news, to offer the gospel, in the midst of what we are all seeing in the world around us. Every minute of every day, we are bombarded by information about climate change and ecological destruction. It's a constant topic in our news, our social media feeds, entertainment, politics, and often as people who care deeply about justice and social change, in our personal relationships and activist circles as well. And I think that we hope that constant conversation will be the thing that creates the change that we know is desperately needed, especially as our leaders fail to do what's necessary time and time again. This applies to more than the climate crisis. In our digital age, we have immediate access to more information and in more ways than was even imaginable a century ago, let alone thousands of years ago when our scripture readings were first written. We were not created for this. We were not created for this. As creatures created by a loving God, we are not designed for constant exposure to endless information about how we are actively in danger against a threat that we cannot take immediate and efficient action towards making ourselves safe from. Science shows us that stress has a very specific function in humans. We're exposed to a stressor, so let's say a bear, and then our body is activated to respond, run away from the bear. And then, when the danger has passed, our body completes the stress cycle and we come back to a sense of rest and equilibrium. When we're unable to respond to a stressor, that stress response isn't given the opportunity to be resolved. We're stuck in the middle of the stress cycle, which is not what our bodies are designed to do. This is why we can experience a whole range of mental and physical health issues when we're constantly exposed to stress that we cannot fix. Eco-anxiety is unfortunately a perfect example of this. The climate crisis feels really big and out of our control, and those feelings are real. Eco-anxiety is a legitimate response to seeing what is happening in our world. But feeling discouraged and overwhelmed by our circumstances and the state of the world is not unique to our modern era. Our second reading this morning came from the book of Ecclesiastes, and I'm going to be really honest. I picked it because I'd heard that passage before and I thought it had a good vibe. And then I found out more about the book of Ecclesiastes. The writer is, for the most part, sharing the thoughts of a teacher who's not so concerned with the heavenly realm or with an afterlife, but with our day-to-day realities in the here and the now. The teacher says throughout the book that despite seeking great accomplishments and experiences, they have found that all is hevel. Hevel is a Hebrew word which means breath or vapor. The NRSV translates this word as vanity, but others translate hevel as meaningless, pointless, useless, absurdity. The teacher observes how lacking in logic and order the world is, and how unsatisfying and ultimately meaningless all the things we chase after in this life are. In chapter 2, they decry the burden of human striving, asking, "What do mortals get from all their toil and strain with which they toil under the sun? For their days are full of pain, and their work is vexation. Even at night their minds do not rest." And later in chapter 3, verse 16, the teacher says, "I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, wickedness was there, and in the place of righteousness, wickedness was there as well." Like ours, the world of Ecclesiastes is marked by injustice and oppression, as well as feelings of futility when the work that we do does not produce the outcome that we were hoping for. In the Gospels, we also see Jesus grapple with the pain and the hopelessness of the people that he came to serve, as well as the frustration of those frustration of those who misunderstood and sought to undermine his ministry. So what does the Bible offer us in response to our despair at injustice and our frustration when the impact of our work feels limited? The reading we heard from Ecclesiastes says that for everything there is a season, and then shares a poem where we see this play out in all manner of opposites. The poem begins by drawing on the rhythms of nature and natural processes to emphasize its point: birth and death, planting and harvesting, being wounded and then healing. Then it moves on to human sentiment, like weeping and laughing, mourning and dancing, embracing and not embracing. And finally, it speaks to human activities: tearing and sewing, silence and speaking, loving and hating, being at war and being at peace. For many of the binaries offered in the poem, it's natural for us to prefer one over the other. We prefer laughter over weeping, birth over death, dancing over mourning, love over hate. However, the point that the teacher of Ecclesiastes is making is that all of these feelings and actions have their place in the broader tapestry of our lives. With the climate crisis, it often feels like our response must be one of urgent and total attention. And this is understandable given the magnitude of the problem. However, we also know that this is not a sustainable approach to discipleship, that continuing in this way can limit our energy and our motivation for acting in future. When we experience eco-anxiety, we also recognize that being consumed by our concerns can harm us. The teacher of Ecclesiastes offers us another perspective, drawing on the rhythms of nature and our day-to-day lives to highlight that all responses have their place. There is a time to weep and a time to laugh. There's a time to mourn and a time to dance. There's a time to make sure that we're recycling and composting correctly, and a time to lounge on the couch watching Netflix. There's a time to go to protests and a time to honor our need for rest. There's a time to lament what humans have done to the world, and a time to rejoice in the beauty and the providence of creation. Church traditions also offer us examples of honouring different seasons. I grew up in the Coptic Orthodox Church, which has a long and rich history of fasting and feasting. There are fasting practices that take place on a more day-to-day basis, so fasting before communion or on particular days of the week, as well as many periods of fasting throughout our church calendar. Our seasons of fasting are always followed by a feast. We fast in anticipation of the celebration to come, the feasts where we mark significant occasions from Scripture in community with one another. The most prominent of these seasons are, of course, Christmas and Easter. After fasting for weeks, we go to church late in the evening on Christmas Eve and Easter Saturday, and then we come together at someone's home, the aunties put on a spread like nobody's business, and we break our fasts together. We feast. We celebrate what God has done for us. In Scripture, we're also offered models of divine rest. Our first reading from Genesis starts with God coming to the end of the creation process after 6 days and resting on the seventh day. God blessed that seventh day and set it aside as holy. This story is bookended on either side with separate accounts of the creation of humanity. In chapter 1, verse 26, God says, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness." And as part of our reading in chapter 2, verse 7, God forms the first human out of the dust of the ground and animates them with her own breath. To be made in the image of God is to require and be worthy of rest. We do not become worthy of rest through works because we've done something and only then are worthy. We don't earn rest the way we might earn time in lieu or rewards points. And often we have a voice in our head that tells us we've not done enough to be worthy of rest. That is not what Scripture tells us. That's the world. That's capitalism that shames and punishes our human need for rest, calling it unproductive, self-indulgent, lazy. No, this is not the truth and this is not the gospel. God makes this clear in her mandates throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. In the 10 Commandments and throughout the law, God commands the Israelites to keep the Sabbath as a holy day of rest, as God rested on the seventh day of creation. In the Gospels, we have multiple accounts of Jesus taking time to rest during his ministry, seeking solitude from the crowds to pray. As creatures created in the image of God, if God needed rest after creation, if Jesus needed rest in the midst of his ministry, how much more so do we as human beings require rest? When Jesus was confronted by the Pharisees because his disciples were plucking heads of grain to eat on the Sabbath, he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath." In the beginning, God, in her goodness, knew that we needed rest and offered us the Sabbath as a gift. God set aside the Sabbath as a holy day of rest, not for her sake, but for ours. The Sabbath is a sign of God's grace. As I said at the beginning of this sermon, God did not design our bodies to be in a constant and unresolvable state of stress. We were not created for this. We know this from modern science, but we also know this from our faith traditions. From the wisdom offered by God through Scripture, from the very beginning of Genesis, all the way through to the incarnation of Christ, and from the wisdom God has offered us in the whole of creation, which moves in patterns and rhythms. To be a part of God's creation is to require rest. To be made in the image of God is to be worthy of rest. And to be a disciple is to be called to rest. Many of the practices that science tells us that we need to resolve our stress cycle can also be found in our ancient faith traditions. Prayer, contemplation, connecting with one another in community, breaking bread together, singing songs of lament, thanks, and worship together. In the face of eco-anxiety, we can also explore and connect with the natural world as a space to renew our relationship with creation beyond our fear and our despair, with gratitude towards God and the earth for their beauty and for providing for our needs. God has created us in her image. We are beloved by God and worthy of the time that we take away from the work to rest and to reconnect with ourselves, with our communities, and with God. There are absolutely seasons where work and agitation and labour are necessary, but there also must be seasons of rest. That is how God created her creation, that is how Christ proclaimed the gospel, and that is how we are called to live as disciples.